how much risk is a farmer taking on by going non-insecticidal routes?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, even with the BT, you have to have pressure to see different economic differences. So we didn't see enough caterpillar BT to be different than the non-BT. Um, and it's possible we did have pest pressure, but it wasn't controlled by any of those insecticides, right? And so it was the same across all of them. There has been some work done in the Corn Belt that suggests you can get away with not using insecticides for about 4 years before you start to see some of the classic corn pests resurging in the field. But it also really depends kind of on the landscape of how many people are choosing to do that or not, because you are benefiting from your neighbor using it potentially, and keeping the pest pressure down. Um, so it is something that you're going to have to watch, and it also depends, again, what the pest is. It is important, like economically, sometimes the pest pressure is not worth it. Even still, it's probably managing it might be more expensive than the damage that's being caused. And so that's the other piece that's a little tricky for farmers to see is what is the cost of buying BT or the cost of paying for seed treatments. That's kind of buried in the overall purchasing as well. But they're not free. And one of the costs of production that's been rising dramatically over the last few years is the cost of seed itself. So that is a big input cost for operations.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Luke McCauley. I'm your host of the Land and Wildlife Speaker Series. I'm the Wildlife Management Specialist for University of Maryland Extension, and you are joining our monthly Land and Wildlife Speaker Series, where I'm very excited to have Dr. Kelly Hamby. We'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel. It helps to get the word out to more people as we continue our educational efforts. Today, we're going to cover wildlife-friendly insect management in corn and soybean farming. And the reason I wanted to invite Kelly to come speak was I'm working at Point Pleasant Farm, where we're integrating habitat with regular standard agricultural practices. And I realized that I didn't have a very good knowledge of all the different types of insecticides and practices that farmers are using and how that could impact wildlife, especially for this property. We're looking to optimize it for bobwhite quail and the impacts of different farming practices on insects. And those insects are key for the early growth of poults and chicks. And I was thinking I need to learn more about what are the best practices so that the farmer can still have a good operation so it can be profitable, but also not apply things that are going to sort of nuke all the insect diversity on the property. So Kelly I've seen her speak before, and she's very knowledgeable. I'm really looking forward to this.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and I'm really happy to be talking to you all today. So I would like to start with why do we care about insects? And Luke kind of mentioned that for a minute there, but actually there are lots of reasons that insects are kind of amazing organisms to study and work with. So we have globally, there's incredible insect biodiversity. Over 50% of all described species are insects. And that's just the described species. There's a lot of undescribed species that are still out there for us to discover for a lot of organisms. But we are quite aware that we have only really scratched the surface of some groups of insects. And I like this picture because it kind of shows all of the different things that insects can do. Amongst having all of those species, they also have a lot of different life history strategies. They're in the water, they're on the land, they're doing all kinds of things that are really interesting and really important for ecosystems. So some of the reasons that insects are important to ecosystems, of course, they're important for biological control in agriculture, where they're feeding on other insects or other arthropods, and causing and helping regulate their populations. Pollination services are often very common, very well understood as being very important. Much of the food that we grow requires insect pollination for getting good yields. Some people don't think about this as much, but we've actually had to introduce dung beetles places because their insects are also really important decomposers and really important for nutrient cycling. Also in aquatic systems, they're really important decomposers where they're breaking down leaf litter and capturing sediment in water. And of course, the reason that you all might be interested in insects is they're really important food sources for others. Even ourselves, we can eat insects, but insectivorous birds really need the protein that insects can provide, and a main part of their diet is insects. So one of the reasons that it's important to think about insects also is there's growing evidence that insects are in decline. So the reason that they're in decline is a multifaceted. There's lots of things that are contributing to that. Changes in climate and weather patterns are impacting where they can be. A lot of habitat loss, pollution, including agrochemicals, as I'll get to in a minute. There's other emerging threats that are always coming out. And of course, invasive species also are an issue where they're pushing out native species in the insect world as well. So in terms of the potential impacts of agriculture, the major pieces of this potential loss to insect biodiversity that agriculture is interacting with is, of course, habitat loss, where more of our lands are going into agriculture, or when we're doing agriculture, how that's impacting habitats as we're feeding a growing global population. And then, of course, agrochemical pesticides and fertilizers can also impact insect biodiversity, and we will talk more about that throughout the talk today. So specifically today, we're really focusing in on corn and soybeans. A huge part of Maryland's land area is actually in corn and soybean farming. I think it's around 33% of our total land mass is corn and soybean fields. And we have all of these activities from planting to harvest that could be potentially impacting insects. And of course, insects are major pests of corn and soybean agriculture as well, and other cropping systems. So it's also important to manage insect pests so that they're not competing for our foods and fibers. So I want to focus on 4 major topics today related to this. First, I want to talk about providing habitat for diverse insects within corn and soybean systems. Also, how we can adopt integrated pest management as a strategy for managing our pests in these grain systems to help reduce our impacts. Some of the specific challenges that corn and soybean producers are facing. And then also I want to end today with just a little note on how you can preserve insects at home. So starting off with providing habitat for diverse insects, one of the things that I really like about working in Maryland, and one of the things I've always found fascinating, is Maryland farmers have adopted a lot of conservation practices. And these conservation practices, so we're #1 in the nation for the percentage of our available cropland that's planted to cover crops, have been adopted to improve soil health and water quality. So to reduce runoff of nutrients into the bay and to save the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland grain growers have adopted a lot of really wonderful practices. And you can see more about that at the Maryland Grain Producers website. They have a whole page on conservation that I have a QR code there for you if you'd like to learn more. But those conservation practices, things like reducing tillage, cover cropping, providing buffer strips, doing contour farming, which again helps reduce erosion, and lots of other practices that they're adopting, all can help protect insects as well. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So here you can see on the left, there's a planter and it's going into a field without having tilled the field. And then what that looks like from the perspective of the corn there, you can see there's lots of residue on the ground where the corn is coming up through what was there previously, whether that was a cover crop or a former crop. So the nice thing about cover cropping is that it provides structural complexity of vegetation, which is important for diverse insects. So you have tall and short plants, you have flowering plants and non-flowering plants. That structural complexity really helps improve insect biodiversity, especially the availability of having nectar and pollen floral resources, since a lot of insects rely upon nectar and pollen. The other important thing with adopting this no-till practice is that many insects spend all or part of their life cycle in the soil. And often that's the piece of the life cycle we understand the least because it's very difficult to study insects under the soil. But this is just an example of the life cycle of fireflies, which of course varies quite a bit between species. But generally speaking, they may spend their egg and larval stages as well as their pupal stages in the soil. How deep in the soil varies, They may pupate in big groups right under the soil. If you look at A in this diagram, that's them pupating. Or they may have individual chambers under the soil, but they spend up to 2 years as a larva, and they're predatory. So they're feeding on they're feeding on snails and slugs and earthworms and other soft-bodied organisms in the soil and the leaf litter. So they spend a large part of their time right there at the soil interface or under the soil before they come up and do that beautiful flashing in the early summer. So that's one example of an insect that spends quite a bit of its life in the soil. And so by not tilling, we're not disturbing that habitat, and we're not breaking up those insect pupae and killing them. So that's another reason that these soil conservation practices can be good for insects. So I'd like to move on now to adopting integrated pest management, and I will first start by describing what is integrated pest management. So integrated pest management, or IPM, you might have heard, is a sustainable, science-based decision-making process. So it's really how you think and make decisions around pest management, and this is a strategy to do that. And the goal is to minimize health and environmental risks. This is human health as well as the health of the environment, while increasing profitability, but while making sure that we're still providing the food and fibers that we need. And how do we do that? The major tenets of this is really, so I like to use this IPM pyramid, where you're really focused on prevention. So I don't know, hopefully some of you have seen in the past, like the food nutrition pyramid, right? This pyramid works the same, where the lower levels, you want to see more of those levels used, and then less and less as you go up the pyramid. So here we're really focusing on spending most of our practices on prevention, trying to avoid ever having pest issues, right? And then as you move up to detection and moving up through the control, that we're minimizing our reliance, where chemical controls or pesticides are really our last resort. And so I'll walk through each of these layers with a little bit more detail. So in terms of prevention, what can we do in grain crops to prevent having pests? This is one of the oldest pest management strategies. It's been recorded throughout history. If you rotate your crops, so you're not constantly cropping the exact same crop in the exact same place, you can reduce the buildup of insect and pathogen pests from year to year. So a lot of our grain farmers are already doing this, where they might rotate full season soybeans into winter wheat, into double crop soybeans, into corn. So they're alternating between a legume crop and a grass crop, and they're also alternating the 3 major grain crops within the system. And where we see more pest pressure a lot of times is in land where they aren't able to do that for whatever reason. Maybe it's not as productive in corn, so you can't really get it into corn very often. But one strategy for prevention is crop rotation. The other thing you can do for prevention in terms of insect pest management is you can use hybrids that are already resistant to damage. And this is also true for some pathogens as well. And the major tool that we have in our toolbox for insect pests in terms of prevention are the genetically modified crops that express a protein from Bacillus thuringiensis, which is an entomopathogenic, so it's a pathogen of insects, bacteria, that expresses proteins that end up popping the insect's midgut. So this is a plant-incorporated protectant the plant is expressing throughout all of its plant tissues that specifically targets caterpillar and beetle pests. So you can choose to plant these hybrids and specifically already control a lot of the caterpillar pests that are directly feeding on the crop. The next piece of that is detection. So it's really important when you're managing pests to make sure that you have identified the pest correctly, because the things that you can do to manage the pest are very different depending on which pest you have. And so I like to use, my favorite example of this is looking at slug damage versus seed corn maggot. So slugs are terrestrial mollusks that are very sensitive to desiccation and drying out. And they cause a pitting, kind of a circular pitting on a soybean seedling. Whereas seed corn maggots are the larva of a fly. They also kind of tunnel into the seedling. It tends to be a more narrow tunnel. but they can be controlled by insecticides, where slugs cannot be controlled by insecticides. So that's really important, again, to be able to distinguish which of those two things you have. But once you've identified which insect you have or what's going on, you also want to know, is this actually causing damage? Is this going to impact my yield? Is it going to impact my profitability? And so what we use in integrated pest management is we have something we call a threshold, or a level of damage that you can tolerate. And once you've reached that threshold, you really have to intervene and do something to manage the pest. So in soybeans, we have lots of insects that chew on the leaves of soybeans, and rather than specifically managing each individually, you can actually have a threshold based on how much of the leaf is gone. And so you sample throughout the plant and throughout the field leaflets, and then you look at, if it's between 20%, if it's 20% at the reproductive stage, or 30% on average of the leaves are gone at the vegetative stage, that's enough to be concerned that the pest is going to cause yield limiting damage. So making sure that you have a real problem rather than just a little bit of insect feeding, and tolerating a little bit of insect feeding, is another key component of integrated pest management. And then you want to first rely on things like cultural controls, so ways to manage the pests that don't involve using insecticides. So for example, with slugs like to feed on the seedlings right there in the planting furrow, so if you can get that planting furrow closed, adjusting your closing wheel and your downforce mechanisms when you're planting, making sure the soil is in good condition for planting, not too wet and muddy, you won't have those cracks that really favor the slugs, where they have a cool, moist place to hide while they're feeding. So that's one potential cultural control we can use in corn and soybean farming. Another one, of course, as I mentioned briefly, is biological control. So you can take advantage of the natural enemies of an insect to control an insect. And I really like to use this example. This is a video by Dr. Mike Raup, a colleague in my department, looking at aphids. So I just want to point out, you see this aphid in the center here that's kind of a bronze color. That's what we call a mummy aphid. So instead of being a living aphid, it's actually got a wasp larva living inside it. And so now I'll play this video so you can see the aphids and the wasps interact.
With all this cool wet weather, plants in my garden are just chock-a-block full of aphids, plump juicy aphids, and then papery brown aphid mummies. These are the result of attack of tiny parasitic wasps. I found one of those tiny parasites lurking nearby. Let's see how it makes its attack on the aphids. Tiny braconid wasps are major allies in our battle against aphids. This one's doing a little grooming before she goes out on an aphid hunt. The trick now is to get her eggs inside that aphid. The aphid does its best to defend itself. Watch how it kicks and tries to push the wasp away. Watch how she curls her abdomen underneath herself, between her legs, and tries to sting the aphid on its underside. But unfortunately for the aphid, I think that last sting hits its mark.
So finally, if all of those other strategies have failed you and you have reached an economic level of damage, then you want to use appropriate chemical controls. What do appropriate chemical controls look like? You're trying to use the most selective option possible, and you also want to make sure that the product that you're using is very effective so that you don't have to come back and spray something else again. So selecting the appropriate chemical and using that as a last resort is an important part of integrated pest management as well. So now I would like to talk a little bit more about what are the specific challenges that corn and soybean producers are facing. So to start off with, just to understand how pest management works in corn and soybean, many of our grain pest management decisions are happening at the time when seed is purchased. So you're already picking which hybrid you're going to have, whether it has some resistance to insects or not within it, some insect resistance to diseases or not, and then also whether that seed is coated or not with an insecticide. So for example, you could be planting in corn a plant incorporated insecticide, those BT hybrids like I talked about, and that will give you season-long control in all plant parts. Or you might also be considering a neonicotinoid insecticide seed treatment. And so that's going to be coated on the seed, and that will control early season pests in all parts of the plant because that insecticide is systemic, so it moves up and down through the plant in the phloem. And that is about 4 to 6 weeks you can expect to have effective insect control from that product. And there's also in-furrow pyrethroid insecticides that you can apply during planting that may also control insects. We're not sure how long those actually are effective in the field, but probably somewhere around 2 weeks. So if you're using BT hybrids, as I mentioned, the major targets for those are caterpillars and beetles. In our area, we do not have as much of the below ground beetle pest pressure, the rootworm larvae pressure that other parts of the corn growing regions or the corn belt would have. So primarily, if we're using BT hybrids, we're using these for above ground caterpillars. So caterpillars that are feeding on the leaves or on the ears of the plant. The seed treatments are targeting also those early season caterpillars that might be feeding on the leaves of the plants, potentially stink bugs, bean leaf beetles, some other early season pests, and also the soil pests like wireworms and white grubs. And in addition to the neonicotinoid seed treatments, we also have some products that include diamide seed treatment. So that's another active ingredient of insecticide. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is all BT hybrids are pretty much packaged with a neonic. So you already have both of those together, and you may see they're both controlling caterpillar pests. And then if you think about the in-furrow pyrethroids, they're also targeting the exact same spectrum of pests as the seed treatments that are already coated on the BT hybrids. So you might already see that there is some possibility here that this system is redundant and that we don't need every one of these insecticide options. The other piece that I'm sure some of you are familiar with is that there is some concern about neonicotinoids and their non-target risks to the environment. When they were adopted, and it continues to be true, they're very safe for mammals compared to some other older insecticide classes. And also they're considered a very targeted use of insecticide because it's directly on the seed. It's not being sprayed over the plants and potentially drifting off that way. It's going to be planted right into the soil because it's systemic and it's expressed right there in the plant. But as we've been doing research, we have found only about 2 to 3% of the active ingredient that is applied to the seed is taken up by the crop plants. Most of the insecticide actually ends up staying in the soil or moving into the water, usually through the soil pathway, but it can also run off into the water from the soil surface as well. And so a lot of that active ingredient is moving through the environment. How this compares to how much is being lost when we spray insecticides is a little bit less clear, and also the total active ingredient concentration. But because seed treatments are already packaged on BT, we have been using them on quite a lot of acres. So they're one of the most heavily used insecticides in corn and grain production globally. And so that's another reason why this is of concern. So my PhD student, Maria Kramer, and I conducted a replicated field experiment across 3 research farms in Maryland. And we were really interested in asking, how do each of these early season pest control methods work, and do we need all of them? So what we did is we used in both a BT hybrid and a non-BT hybrid, and we were able to get the exact same genetic background. Most of the years, 2020 was a special year for everyone. So it wasn't quite the same, but we had a non-BT hybrid, which was an 1197 hybrid, and then we also had a BT hybrid that was 1197. So they're very, very similar then in their yield potential, which is difficult to do. And then we tested them each with either having completely bare seed, there's nothing on it at all, having poncho, which is a neonicotinoid seed treatment, the active ingredient clothianidin, or using Capture in Furrow, which is an in-furrow pyrethroid insecticide, active ingredient bifenthrin. And we replicated this at 3 different farms over 3 different years with 3 plots per field. So this was a heavily replicated experiment. And so across those 3 years and 3 sites, what we're looking at here on the y-axis is the mean percent of the plants that were damaged by insects. And then on the x-axis, we have the control, so that's the completely bare seed. We have the Capture, which is the in-furrow pyrethroid, and we have the poncho, which is the seed treatment. And so you can see in the BT corn, the seed treatment did reduce insect pressure, but there was no additional benefit for adding an in-furrow pyrethroid. But in the non-BT corn, where you're not having any protection from the protectant in the plant, both of those insecticides actually did reduce pest pressure compared to a bare seed. But that insect pest pressure was below economic threshold. So the closest we ever got to exceeding a threshold was in armyworm. So here's some image of armyworm damage on the left in the armyworm caterpillar. Our threshold in corn is around 23% of the plants damaged and a live caterpillar there. So in 1 year at one site, we got close to having economic pressure, but really that pressure was usually around less than 5% damaged by armyworm. And cutworms are a much more severe pest. They can actually cut the whole plant off. So the treatment threshold with larvae present is 5% of the plants showing damage. And again, only in one of the treatments, one of the site years, did we really see getting close to that level of damage. So even though we're controlling insects, those insects weren't really causing a major problem. So it's not surprising then, across 3 years and 3 sites, when we were looking at the yield of the corn, there was no difference, regardless of whether it was BT or non-BT, between the untreated and the insecticide-treated treatments. The good news here then is that you can get really nice grain yields without using insecticides. Of course, we're also experiencing reduced pest pressure because we've adopted these insecticides for so long and these pests have been suppressed. So if everyone stopped using them for a long time, it's possible the pest pressure would resurge. So in terms of grain insect pest management, you really have to remember that in terms of the economics, preventative approaches are only going to be effective for consistent pests. When you're buying your seed, you need to already know you're going to have a pest problem. A lot of insect pests are not like that, where you will know, yep, this is going to be a year where we're really going to have a problem. They often come sporadically or occasionally, so they're not always, preventative pest options are not always the best, pest management options are not always the best for insect pests. One of the pests that are well targeted by preventative insecticides is soil pests. And this is because they're a complex of multiple species, and many of them have multi-year life cycles. So they're going to be in the same ground year after year because it takes them a while to develop. So they can be persistent issues. The other reason they're a good target is because they're very hard to control with anything else. So this is things like white grubs. I think you can see my arrow. It's a little white caterpillar on the left, and then there's a little brown beetle larva. These are both beetle larvae. The white grub is the larva of a June beetle, and then the little brown one, the wireworm, is a larva of a click beetle. So both of these feed on seedlings and cause stand loss. So there's really nothing else you can do in terms of managing soil pests than to use a soil insecticide. And because they're more predictable than other pests, and because we have nothing else to manage them, neonicotinoid seed treatments and other seed treatments are really important tools for our farmers to control them and reduce the stand loss where you have these problems. But as I mentioned, for there to be economic benefit, you have to have pest pressure. So this is a study we did in 2018 and 2019 where we were comparing the different options in a field where we knew we had pest pressure, but only in 2019 did we see control, because in 2018 actually it was one of those years where it was a little bit wet and it took us a while to get into the ground and plant it, and the wireworm activity had already dropped off. So you have to have pest pressure for them to pay off. So what is the alternative? What provides a little bit more flexibility than using preventative pest management strategies? You can use foliar insecticide applications and use them when you can treat most corn and soybean pests at thresholds. So when you see a problem for everything except soil pests, you have time to go out and adjust your management and do something about it with a foliar insecticide. So things like stink bugs, for example. You can go see stink bug damage, go out and spray for stink bugs, and expect to get decent control. How are farmers making the decision whether or not to use seed treatments or whether or not to use BT? A colleague in North Carolina actually did a survey to try to determine this. And a lot of this is they're asking their seed company, what do you recommend? What's the best option? What do you have available, right? So a lot of these decisions are being made by the people who are selling these products. Of course, we're happy to see also extension recommendations are having a major impact. They may have specific insect concerns, and then yield potential and cost also has a role also in how they're deciding. And then in further south in us, stink bugs and soil pests are the major drivers of the decision to use these treatments. For BT, they're really choosing BT based on yield potential. And that was one of the things about the study that my PhD student Maria did that was really important, is that a lot of the BT varieties have higher yield potential or are put in genetic backgrounds that have really good yield potential. And so picking the right variety, the one that's going to yield the best, is of course very important as well. And they may be picking for yield potential and then getting all of these extra pest management options, whether they want them or not. And second to yield potential is in the industry recommendations, the insect control efficacy of those particular hybrids, with extension recommendations a little bit lower on the BT side. So the other piece I wanted to end with on why is it so challenging to manage insect pests and what are some of the constraints is it can be a little bit tricky to determine exactly what you have when you're buying your seeds. So I've given you an example soybean seed bag. If you were to flip back behind that first tag, there's a second tag that lists all of the chemicals that are coated on the seed, but you're already having to look at a different tag there. And some of the tags, they don't even really, you have to go then take the code and then translate the code to figure out which active ingredient. So it's not always as easy as you might think to tell what specifically is on the seed. To get it untreated, you often have to order it earlier than if you were to order it treated, because a lot of the seed is already treated at that point when later in the season. However, the good news is if you're using local seed dealers, a lot of the local companies actually do provide more options and have more untreated options also, if that's something that you're interested in. So in terms of what are the corn and soybean IPM best practices that are going to help you target your pest pressure but also preserve insect biodiversity, again, really adopting those conservation practices, using no-till, rotating, using cover crops. Those are all great things that are going to help give you great insect biodiversity without having pest outbreaks. If you can use your foliar insecticides to manage pests and apply them at threshold when you do have damaging levels. Adopting BT is really nice and does provide some great control because it's so specific to caterpillars. But it comes with the seed treatments, which is a bit taking away from that specificity and then giving you a broad spectrum insecticide that's being applied on a lot of acres, whether it's needed or not. So finally, I just want to wrap up with a short message about insect conservation at home. And I have some resources, and I will cycle back to these as well, some QR codes where I'm getting these recommendations from. So my colleague, Dr. Karen Burkhart, has a really nice fact sheet on managing city and suburban yards and gardens to sustain insect communities. And there's also a nice paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on 8 simple actions you can take to save insects. So you heard a bit about this, I think, at your last month's webinar. But just like in grain crops, the best thing that you can do to help preserve insects is to provide them food and habitat. So having complex vegetation, so this is a picture of my backyard. You can see I have grasses, broadleaves. They're short, tall shrubs, trees. A mixture of vegetation really helps, gives them a lot of different resources. Incorporating native plants, it doesn't have to be 100% native, but having native plants, there's a lot of really specific caterpillars, for instance, are going to feed on specific host plants. So having their host plant available is going to be important. Monarch butterflies need milkweed, for example. And I just put this pretty caterpillar that I found in the woods, but that I thought was cool there. But also, again, just like with our cover crops, if you can incorporate flowering plants, things that provide nectar and pollen resources, that also can help in having flowers for as much of the season as possible. You also want to provide them shelter. So winter is a pretty harsh time for all of us, perhaps. So having shelter, having places to overwinter. There's also other ways that insects are using resources. So this is a time of year where you might hear leave the leaves. But leaving area with leaves, there are a lot of insects and organisms that use that leaf litter as a part of their home. And that also is potentially a place where they're overwintering. Leaving the stems from your plants, so you can see that, again, this is my backyard in the winter, you can see that all of the sticks from those flowers and things are still there. There's a lot of bees that use the hollow stems from last year to make their nests, so having stems is useful. Having decaying woods, maybe making bundles of sticks, or if you have a tree that's fallen and it's not really in the way, leave it there, because there's also, again, lots of decomposers and things that need that decaying wood as a habitat. As much as possible, reduce your pesticide use, herbicides, insecticides, fertilizers. So adopt IPM, use selective materials when needed for your house. So I use this example of, so that bacteria that we use for BT corn, you can buy it as a pesticide, and it's really great for controlling caterpillars specifically in your yard. So if you need to control caterpillars, I recommend Bacillus thuringiensis. Another thing to think about is reducing exterior lighting. So amber or red light is less attractive to insects than bright lights, and if you're spending any time outdoors at night, also using a red headlamp will keep you from getting an insect in the eye. But those lights being attractive to insects, that pulls them away from where they're supposed to go. It keeps them from mating and finding food. And we're finding that light pollution is having negative impacts on insects' success. So if you don't want to switch to amber lights, you also might consider using motion activated options so that the lights are only turning on when you need them rather than leaving them on all evening. Also consider the water pollution. How are you washing your car? What are you sealing your driveway with? Are you using what kinds of ice melters are you using? A lot of these things wash off into waterways and negatively impact aquatic insects. So biodegradable soaps, coal tar-free sealants, and salt-free ice melters all help conserve aquatic insect life. So again, if you want more information on that, I left the QR codes, and I also sent Luke the PDFs if you want the PDF.
Great.
So I would like, real quick, I'd like to acknowledge my PhD student, Dr. Maria Kramer, whose work I focused today, and some of my other students. I am very thankful to the corn and soybean growers of Maryland who have provided a lot of funding for my work. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. I know I've been taking some notes. First off, we had some questions about the land area in the chat of crops. And I did pull up some of the land cover data. It looks like it's about 17.7% of Maryland's land area is in crops, is in agriculture. And of that, it's about 7.2% is in corn and 7.5% is in soybeans. That's in 2022. Those numbers are generally pretty similar year to year. So just wanted to put that out there for everybody. Corn and soybeans are the bulk of our agricultural production in Maryland by far. And they cover a large area of our land. So just want to put that out there for everybody. And then Cyril had a question, and Kelly, you might have some knowledge of this. She asked, is there such a thing as companion planting for farmers, or is crop rotation it?
Yeah, so there is companion planting or intercropping. That's definitely something that is in a lot of systems. Particularly, it's more common in vegetables than it is in corn and grain. Corn and grain are really, especially corn, is really dialed in to where you don't want to have any competing plants, because like the row spacing is perfectly so that you get the biggest ear you can get, right? So they don't really in the grain production produce companion plants, but for instance, sweet alyssum, which is a flower, is a common companion plant in California for growing lettuce, because it provides biological control services and some nectar and pollen resources also for those biological control services. So it does happen. There is companion planting. And also one of my colleagues, Dr. Cerruti Hooks, has some great research on using living mulches, so as a way to control weeds and also add plant biodiversity to cropping, again, primarily in vegetable systems.
We've got some more thank yous from people. Thanks for making the aquatic insect connection. I've got a few questions. I've been jotting down notes because I'm really curious about this topic. It sounds like how much, let's start at a very high level between corn and soybeans. And it seems as though there's some things that are particular to corn and some things that are particular to soybeans. And in terms of BT corn, and that's the genetically modified corn that has this, I believe it's a protein you said that will kill insects that feed on the plant. Is there any BT soybeans?
So there's currently a BT soybean that is just being reviewed by the EPA. But no, largely it was, and actually it's interesting because the real important BT crop is cotton, because there's some really serious caterpillar pests of cotton. And those pests actually are also found in corn and soybeans. And so we're worried about that. When these products were developed, there was a lot of concern, and that concern has turned out to be very, very valid, that the insects would develop resistance to these proteins. And so it didn't make sense, because caterpillars were not as severe of a pest in soybeans, to put it into soybeans. And the product that's being released is actually targeted towards a Brazilian market where they have more caterpillar pests. So there are not BT soybeans.
Okay. Now, neonicotinoids sounds like many of the seeds that are conventionally planted are almost always coated on corn. It seems as though you mentioned you had to specially order corn without neonicotinoid coatings. Is that also the case with soybeans, or are soybeans generally not coated?
Unfortunately, the people who track insecticide usage stopped tracking soil seed treatment insecticides, and I think it was in 2015. So we've struggled to accurately get a number on it, but at that time, about 70% of soybeans were treated, and that number was trending upwards. And also wheat can be treated, and that number was trending upwards. And at the time, nearly 100% of corn was treated.
So it sounds like the majority at this stage of conventional seeds you buy are probably going to be coated, it sounds like, with a neonicotinoid.
Unless you specifically select not to. And I do think there are more people who are growing wheat and soybeans that are selecting not to. It is still easier to find them untreated.
And in terms of, you mentioned a few things that a lot of these are very selective, which is good. They're really targeting only the insects that eat that plant. But would you say some are, I would say, more selective than others? It seems as though the neonics, I was surprised to see how much of the majority of that is leaching into the soil and kind of getting lost. At a high level, would you say, is BT maybe a little bit more friendly in terms of what it takes out versus a neonic or other aspects like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, insecticides vary a lot in their selectivity and also in their non-target risks. So, it's always, you're trying to choose, like, which do you care about more, the monarchs or the bees? That's how I like to put it. Because, each insecticide has its pros and cons. And for example, the diamide insecticides are actually really selective. They're really selective for caterpillars also. They're really safe on pollinators. They're one of our next generation ones that actually has quite many fewer non-target impacts than some of the older chemistries, but they're still pretty rough on aquatic crustaceans, and they're also really good at caterpillars. So they're really non-target impacts on monarchs are really high for those. Neonicotinoids have been highlighted as one that's particularly dangerous for pollinators because they are systemic and they can get into nectar and get taken back to hives. In terms of for mammalian toxicity, they're much less dangerous than some of the other seed treatments that came before them. So they're less harmful, for example, and this is another piece, it's still not great for birds to eat pesticide-treated seed, and they will sometimes dig them out of the ground and eat them. But the products that were available before neonicotinoids were pretty toxic to vertebrate organisms. So it's always, a trade-off.
Some positive developments in terms of more selectivity, things that are more friendly to other wildlife, vertebrate species, but we still have these non-target impacts to
Yeah.
pollinating.
But yes, I would say on the whole that BT really is. And because again, anything that's inside the plant and held inside the plant more, also it's moving less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned like bees bringing this back to the hives. Is that only if they're feeding on the crop, or is it only for like overspray, or how would, like, if these are only in the plant tissue, are butterflies or caterpillars or bees feeding on the nectar of crops themselves and then bringing that toxic insecticide back, or is it from overspray situations or things like that?
The above. So when you have a systemic insecticide, that the nectar often they can get it. It can get into the nectar because neonicotinoids are very water soluble. That's one of the reasons why we're finding them in the water so much. That's how the plant moves them, is it moves through the water of the plant. So that can, if they're still present and they're still being uptaken while the plant is flowering, that can move into the nectar, and then the bees can get it in the nectar. With a foliar insecticide, most of the product labels, that's one of the reasons they caution you not to spray at bloom, or if you have to spray at bloom, to spray at night, because you're going to then directly contaminate the flowers, the pollen and the nectar that are on the flowers. So you can be, and this is within the crop, and then nearby the crop, often there is going to be some runoff, there's going to be some spray drift. And with the seed treatments, also there's concern that because they're in the soil, other plants that are not crop plants are going to take them up and express them in their flowers as well.
Now, I think you had mentioned that neonics work for about, I think, 2 to 3 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm.
Are a lot of those, then by the time a soybean is flowering, are a lot of those levels below thresholds to impact some insects? Are they, are there some target ways where you can think about certain crops, or is corn, are they feeding on, does nectar, I don't know about this, does corn have nectar? Are they feeding on nectar on corn, or there's not really flower on corn? I would think so, but are they feeding on it in some way and picking up those in the early few weeks of the plant's life?
Mm-hmm. So in corn, it's more looking at it in potentially in dew or things where they're drinking water. That could be happening early in the season. Yes, as you're suggesting, the residue level should be much, much lower by the time the plant is flowering, because, and that is also why it's no longer effective against insect pests, which are usually a little bit better at detoxifying things because they're feeding on plants, and plants are chemically defending themselves against herbivores or against things that are trying to eat them. So insect pests in general tend to be better at detoxifying things than pollinators, for example, because pollinators are not necessarily eating plant tissue that's defended. So yes, the residue level is lower, but also the organisms might be susceptible at a lower level than an insect pest is.
Now, one of the things you mentioned is that I was shocked to see results that a lot of the BT corn doesn't make yield differences in your fields. Now, for a farmer trying to make a living and taking on that level of risk, how you would share, a lot of, like, sounds like watching for crops, looking for the threshold of damage beyond. You had different thresholds for different crops, or different pests. But do if you go, how much risk is a farmer taking on by going non-insecticidal routes? It sounds like in your study you found wasn't an issue, but as you said, these are sort of, everything's been taken care of for many years through existing pesticides. Are there risks over the course of several years that these insects might start to rear up and a farmer might experience a crop loss? I know it's probably very hard to answer, but would you venture a guess, like how many years you could get away with it, or do you rotate in and out, and or just watch your crops a little bit more? How would you think about a farmer's decision?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, even with the BT, you have to have pressure to see economic differences. So we didn't see enough caterpillar BT to be different than the non-BT. And it's possible we did have pest pressure, but it wasn't controlled by any of those insecticides, right? And so it was the same across all of them. There has been some work done in the Corn Belt that suggests you can get away with not using insecticides for about 4 years before you start to see some of the classic corn pests resurging in the field. But it also really depends kind of on the landscape of how many people are choosing to do that or not, because you are benefiting from your neighbor using it potentially, and keeping the pest pressure down. So it is something that you're going to have to watch, and it also depends, again, what the pest is. Some of the caterpillar pests you can manage, like you can monitor for them with thresholds, and then come in with a foliar insecticide, and it will work. Some of the caterpillar pests, that's not going to work so well. So it also depends kind of what the pressure is. I neglected to mention, but it is important, like economically, sometimes the pest pressure is not worth it. Even still, it's probably managing it might be more expensive than the damage that's being caused. And so that's the other piece that's a little tricky for farmers to see, is what is the cost of buying BT or the cost of paying for seed treatments. That's kind of buried in the overall purchasing as well. But they're not free. And one of the costs of production that's been rising dramatically over the last few years is the cost of seed itself. So that is a big input cost for operations.
This raises a really good question. Is how, first off, do you have an estimate? Where can you buy these seeds, and how much can you pay less for seeds that are not treated? Is non-BT corn cheaper than BT corn, and non-seed coated seeds cheaper?
Yes, we know they are. How much cheaper is very difficult to get a good number on. The estimates are typically around $8 to $10 an acre, maybe upwards to 20, depending on whether it's a seed treatment versus BT. But it's tricky to get good numbers on, because it is generally, first off, like anything you're buying, you have your dealer, how much you're buying, whether you're getting a discount, what they have available, what they're trying to get rid of. All of these things are playing a role in it. But also, these packages are being sold as high yielding packages. So usually the best yielding varieties are going to have multiple treatments and BT incorporated in them. And so you're kind of paying for what we like to call the Cadillac option. And then, then you get all of that as a benefit. And so it's hard to tease apart what exactly you're paying for.
So you could say potentially thinking, I'm trying to remember how much a bag of wheat costs. Maybe it's around $100 a bag these days, and corn can be, I think, even higher. So you could save potentially maybe 10% or so on your seed costs if you get some of these non-insecticidal options. That may be a rough guess. Gotcha. I won't put you on the record on that one, but because I'm sure, like you said, there's a lot of variables in seed pricing. Where can you get these, and how early do you have to order them? Is it, you just talk to your seed dealer and they can find people, or there's some clearinghouses that really focus on this? I know one farmer we're having a workshop at his, or one landowner we're having a workshop at his property tomorrow, and he goes through a specialty dealer. Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, so the larger companies, and they are treating them in kind of bulk before they ship them out in a lot of cases. So you have to get it in pretty early. When I'm doing it for research, if I haven't ordered it now for next year, it gets harder and harder to find, because it's kind of going through the line getting treated. Local companies tend to be, in general, they offer more varieties, and they tend to treat them less. They'll still treat them if you want them, but they often are not necessarily. And one of the other pieces of this and why they're treated like that is it also helps preserve the seed from getting storage pests. So people sometimes like it because they can leave the seed laying around, and they have less problems with the pests that in their grain storage, before they plant it. But that's another thing that I've really been talking to farmers about, and one of the things that I think is another important piece of this is that the big companies are breeding for the Corn Belt, and they're designing products mostly for the Corn Belt. And conditions are really not the same as the Corn Belt. So the other nice thing about going to more local producers of seed is that they are breeding for our area. So you get breeding for our area and you have more availability of untreated seed. And there is a growing industry for organic. A lot of our grain is going to feed the chickens in the chicken industry, and organic chicken needs organic grain. So there also is a lot of times these companies that are specializing in organic hybrids, those have to be untreated. So that's another way to get untreated seed.
One thing you had mentioned very early on was slugs. And I know that does seem to be maybe a standard practice for application prior to planting. Could you elaborate on maybe some of the impacts of some of the slug control spreads that are putting out, and how important or how necessary are those? I know it seems like it can vary, and it does seem like cover crops can sometimes. I've met some people who say cover crops have exacerbated some slug problems because there's a lot of green forage on the ground, and it sort of helps them get started. Is there anything to that? And yeah, what are the impacts of sort of slug applications, slug control applications, I should say?
Okay, so slugs are a very tricky pest. And we're still trying to get a handle on what is a damaging level of slugs. We are realizing that there's 2 species of slugs, and it may vary in terms of what is a damaging level of slugs between the 2 species. But certainly slugs are probably the major pest that's driving pest management in corn and soybeans in our area. And we do see that it's more commonly associated with no-till cover cropping. I have not seen convincing evidence, and I've actually seen studies that kind of show two different ways. Cover crops make it worse, cover crops make it better. The general mechanisms that are thought to be involved are that cover crops are helping the natural enemies of slugs do better, that cover crops are providing a food source for slugs that's not the crop. And then the opposite of that, where cover crops are making it worse, is that cover crops are feeding the slugs and making them larger and more damaging, making them more successful. Cover crops are making a moist microclimate that makes slugs more happy and spend more time in the field. And we are doing work in my lab and with colleagues throughout the United States. We're trying to kind of get a better handle on that, but we don't really know. The evidence is not convincing one way or the other, which cover crops, what cover crops, how cover crops. The only thing in one of the studies in Virginia that actually predicted slug damage was actually the use of seed treatments. And the thought is that using the neonicotinoid seed treatments is negatively impacting the beneficials that feed on slugs. And so that's one of the reasons why you could actually see that signal.
Wow. Stacy had popped in one question at the very end. We'll hit this and maybe let you have any final takeaways. She asked, could you talk a little more about any natural controls or predators of slugs that could be encouraged?
Yeah, so slugs are good at producing. They produce a defensive slime. It's actually the easiest way to identify them is you poke them with a pencil. It makes them upset, and they produce a defensive slime. And what color that slime is can help you tell what slug it is. So they're not that easy to eat for an organism once they are large. Snakes will eat them. There are some ground beetles that will eat them. There are some actually daddy longlegs of pillions that will eat them. And a lot of them are actually mollusk specialists, the ones that we know for sure eat them. But what eats their eggs and what eats the small slugs is probably even more things than what's going to tackle a more mature slug. So there are natural enemies out there that eat slugs, but it is hard to eat a slug. And then I know you also mentioned really briefly, I want to say, slug baits are spread to control slugs. They're getting better about not dissolving and running off into the water as much. And there's also, depending on whether you're using metaldehyde or iron phosphate, you can kind of mitigate whether they're going to be more dangerous to mammals or not. But
which one would be better of those two?
I am pretty sure that iron phosphate is less dangerous than the metaldehyde to mammals. It's also hard to get a clear picture on how many people are actually spreading slug bait because slug bait is very expensive. So because it's so, like, compared to lots of chemical applications per acre, it's very expensive. So a lot of times what's actually being done for slugs is just replanting the field where the slugs have killed the stand.
Wow. And one final thing I think I'd like to maybe emphasize, see if you would agree with this, is that it seems as though also with foliar applications, sometimes they're added to a tank for an herbicide during an herbicide spray or during some standard practices. Um, I've heard varying reports. It sounds like there's not good data on this, but I've heard some folks say it's probably the majority of the crops receive a foliar pyrethroid application. Perhaps you have some insights on that, but it seems like from your presentation that it's, even though it's very inexpensive, and maybe that's the reason people just throw it into the tank, evaluating the damage on your crops could save you that effort, and really probably more beneficial rather than saving you the $2 an acre. It could save all your insects. Is that what would you add about the foliar applications?
Yeah, so the foliar applications that I recommend are pyrethroid insecticides, which are broad spectrum and will kill natural enemies and all insects. And so where their advantage is that you spray them only when you need them. I agree, they are very, very, very affordable. They're definitely cheaper than neonicotinoids and BT. Um, they've been off patent for a long time. And so there are people who are using them because the major cost then is actually the cost of moving the equipment and the labor of having somebody driving a tractor. So they are sometimes like, why would I come back and pay for another application when I can include it now while I'm spraying a fungicide or an herbicide, whatever else I'm doing. And I have done quite a bit of research um, on whether mixing those it provides a benefit. And again, there's two pieces there: is did you have an economic pest problem, but also is the time for controlling weeds the same time for controlling insects, or the time for controlling pathogens the same time for controlling insects. So in my work, we've never seen a benefit from it, and I think it's a combination of it not being the right time for the major pests, and also they're not being economically justifiable in insect pressure, at least in my studies. There are outbreaks of pests. Like this last year, we had some outbreaks of podworm and aphids that would have justified sprays at economic threshold.
So it seems as though watching your crops, maybe getting an agronomist to be monitoring your damage and monitoring what's going on before making those decisions if you can. Cool. Kelly, thank you so much. I feel like I have a much better understanding of what's going on. I'm going to be digging into sources for different sort of non-treated seeds in the future, and I appreciate you sharing all the stuff you did, and look forward to maybe having you back finish some more of your research up.
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Take care.